Well, in this mini lecture, we want to cover the Synoptic Gospels and want to frame it in a more evangelical perspective. Just know, as you study the Synoptics, there are multiple different views, and from liberal sides of the documentary hypothesis theory, and also the borrowing concepts found within even the evangelical tradition. So these next 14 slides are a way to help define what the synoptics are and how we might rightly come to some agreement on how are the writers of the Gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how are they similar, and how can we answer the dissimilarity of the content found within each of the Gospel. So simply look at it, the graph there of the differences between each of the gospel writer. So when we're talking about the synoptic, we're mainly focusing on Matthew, Mark, and Luke only. John stands outside of the tradition of the synoptic gospel because he's largely, much of his content is 80 to 90% different from the three other writers. So what are we seeing? Simply, that's what synoptic means. It means same, and then optic means to see. What do we see in the text that might be different, that might maybe cause more question? Why does one writer write this parable this way, but then the other writer writes the same parable but shows different qualities or a sense? And so therefore, it causes question for the reader to say, which is more accurate, and who is getting the source from where. And so that's the idea of the synoptic gospel. And hopefully we'll find some relationships here and some answers that will settle your heart down as you work through the particular study. Now, two important source view would be the two source hypothesis view. So there is a position that there's a Q. So there's a source from which um, Matthew and Luke are originating their gospel account. And so Q, Quell, is informing the gospel writers on exactly how they should frame and set up their narrative account. Or if you look at the two source view, is Mark is the main source from which Matthew and Luke are arriving at meaning in the life of Jesus. So hopefully the graphic there can show you how one may be borrowing a source from another. Now, synoptic simply is getting closer to the ideal of what we're trying to say, is that interrelationship between the three writers. We are seeing that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share some similar approaches as they write on the life of Jesus. Of course, all of them at the end are focusing on the end ministry of Christ, his death, his trial, his death, and then his resurrection. So each of the three writers do spend time on that final piece of Christ's life. But then when you consider the infancy side of the gospel, Matthew and Luke spend more time on the beginning days of Christ's life and ministry. And yet Mark is not quite there. His focus is rather quick. And so we want to try to answer that question, why Mark is so quick in his writing and less detail, let's say, than Luke's writing. But both have a different dynamic in quality and in terms of what their purposes are. So we want to try to answer that here, even in this mini lecture. Now, some examples of questions that will arise for the reader, you or myself, is that when we come across a parable or story in which Jesus was sharing, we might find that that story is exactly the same in the three writers. So the conversation is almost identical. You have maybe a little different context, of course, because each of the three writers are coming from a different situation. But nonetheless, Jesus' words are nearly the same in each of the formal narratives. So the question comes up is then where did this verbal agreement come if each of the three writers actually wrote down exactly the same ideas? Did each copy each other along the way? It's a great question that needs to have an answer. And so this is where um, those in the biblical scholarly community begin to offer up some solutions, and some of them are overly liberal in their views. So we want to be careful and come to a careful theological, biblical understanding and framework. Why the same, and how we might answer a critic that would challenge the inerrancy of the Gospels therein. Okay. Now, let me give you a proposed answer to some of how maybe people might frame whether maybe a parable is the same, exactly using the same words, or might there be some differences between the three writers. Of course, number one, we're going to address the oral tradition that exists during the time of both the Old and New Testament. And simply, oral tradition is the passing down of information, stories, ideas, theological concepts in which the church began to pick up and write down through the church fathers. And of course, there's reciprocal borrowing. Mutual independence on one another is a second possible solution to the answer here. And of course, there's the documentary sources that exist, and what we've been discussing here on the idea of Q or Quell, that there is some other source that the three writers picked up, and Mark is the predominant evidence piece from which Matthew and Luke arrive at their primary gospel account in the life of Christ. Now, oral tradition simply is one of the oldest of all the theories. We originate some of those ideas from our early church fathers, such as Papias, Irenaeus. These all have different thoughts on how the gospel writers wrote their narrative and who did they look to for their source and proving the life of Jesus. So even Papias said early that Matthew recorded and wrote in the sayings of Jesus in the Aramaic language. He goes on to say that Mark was Peter's scribe and also interpreter who wrote all things down for Peter, especially in the epistles. And then even Mark's source was Peter, and therefore, because of the non-chronological nature of the Gospel of Mark, he was rather quick in his production of his work. It could have been during a very difficult time in Mark's life, time of duress, and so he wanted to pen and write in such a way that would get to the narrative in the crowning moment of Jesus, and that would be his death on the cross. Irenaeus went on to say, with some similar logic, what Papias said early on, that Luke's gospel was simply a reproduction of a Pauline thought. Interesting way to view it. And so Luke is a researcher, he's a doctor, he's trying to uncover all of the facts. He's arguing and writing apologetically on the life of Jesus. He's trying to prove that Jesus touched individuals and along the way. And of course, the fourth gospel, the John's gospel, stands alone, and he has his own theological direction that he's taking his readers. And of course, when you look at the Gospel of John, you're looking at 85 to 90 AD, some almost 30 years after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they are finishing their ministry. Now, the second would be the reciprocal borrowing, the mutual independence. And there are those within the evangelical community who would say that each of them were borrowing from each other. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all living in an approximate time. They all lived within the approximate geographical location. They all had their encounters with Jesus, so they knew each other. And so then they're borrowing the concepts from one another. They're relying on each other's ideas and thoughts and perspectives, and therefore they go and frame their writings based on the audience to which they're going to write for. So Matthew, of course, is writing to a Jewish audience. Luke is going to be predominantly more Greek focused, and then Mark his emphasis seems to be on the Roman occupation, a Roman colony of the day, and so his perspectives are more geared toward that. But nonetheless, This second area of interpretation is simply saying that each of them are borrowing from one another, vice versa, copying each other, and they're just writing from a different perspective as they move along. Now, documentary sources simply says that there's a hypothesis. So this goes back to the original argument of Q. And so we're looking at that two document hypothesis perspective. And the question is there this document out there, a Q, from which all three writers rely on that particular source? Mark mainly being the predominant influencer for Matthew and Luke. And so we know, looking at both Matthew and Luke, they're quite different, and yet there's some similarity as you think about the different stories and constructs and trajectories to which Matthew and Mark are writing. For example, if you were to examine in line by line or column by column Matthew and Luke's presentation of the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find similar ideas, yet the presentation is also going to be different. So what is the reader to do? Well, namely, from a biblical interpretation point of view, hermeneutics, you need to know that you have a different writer, you have a different perspective. And therefore, if there's a different perspective, there's also a different theological purpose by which the writer is setting out their intention to accomplish. And so we never want to read Matthew into Luke, Luke into Matthew, or Mark, because each of the writers have a particular theological purpose why they are presenting the snapshot that they are on the life of Jesus. So we'll talk a little bit more here as we frame this out. Now, there are some comments that we can think through that shape our teaching. Possibility of other documents existed. Luke talks about that in Luke 1, where he researched accurately all the things of the life of Jesus. So it has to be that he's looking for those pieces of evidence. The question is, what were those evidence pieces? Of course, historical documents are all around, where there's numerous historical accounts of the life of Jesus. And so, yes, we would say that Luke is using those pieces of evidence to prove his argument and his theological purpose. Is there a cube? Is there a hypothetical document that is yet to be found? We don't know. But scholars try to form their theological understanding around what they call form history. And so then they develop what's called redactional history, things that shape the setting and the times and the material that is presented in time, to be able to answer some of these critics who might challenge inerrancy and the authenticity of the Gospels, the Gospel writers, and their framing of the theological purpose. Now, let me give you an evangelical treatment and what can be known about the Gospel. Well, number one, Matthew, he represents, he took much time in watching the Lord Jesus. We know he was a disciple of Jesus. He was called out of a life of being a tax collector. And so much of his framework and his trajectory arguments is around the Jewish audience to whom he is writing to. He's trying to reach the Jewish people. He himself is a Jewish descendant, and so he wants to prove to his audience that Jesus is the rightful king who comes from the line of David. And so that's his argument from chapter 1. And so he builds his narrative around all those things that would connect the reader to the King Jesus, and why Jesus is the rightful heir to the throne. And at times, when you look at Matthew's gospel, you see that his works looks very close to Mark. It could be, my answer to that would be that they lived in close proximity in time, and both in years and also in geography. And so they were able to share with each other the stories and the frameworks and perspectives that most influenced them as they watched the Lord Jesus while he was doing ministry here on earth. What can be known then about Mark? Well, Mark represents the main line of argument. If he is the beginning source, or meaning the first of the gospel writers, there's also good arguments from others of our church fathers that Matthew was the first writer of the gospel, giving an early date of AD 50, but there are also those who are arguing that Mark is the first writer, and so therefore it's Matthew and Luke that are taking their evidence pieces from Mark. So they're setting their scope based on what Mark has already said. And yet we go back to what I've already said about Matthew, is that Mark had a close contact with Jesus and even the apostles. When you get to the book of Acts, you see John Mark is intimately involved in the life of Luke, and one of Luke's close companion also in the life of the apostle Paul. So they're all written in generally the same time. And this goes also what I said before, that maybe particularly why Mark is so fast-paced. He uses the word immediately a lot in that gospel, is because he's under duress, he's facing persecution, and so he just wants to get out the most important details as he sees it, as he writes his gospel account about Jesus, because time is short. And then because the duress then begins to go down, Matthew and Mark spend more time on the detailed portion of the life of Jesus and begin to encourage more of a thoughtful reflection on the accounts and trajectories to which they're writing about. Now, when we consider Luke, he's very independent, as I've already stated. He's a doctor, he's a physician, he's a close companion of the life of Paul, traveling companion, a friend. He's there to help. It seems with Paul, Paul struggled with his health, his eyes, and so the good doctor is his friend. And so we see that encounter. One of the other things you can note that Luke spends a lot of time to teach on apostolic teaching. He's presenting the life of Jesus in such a way that he is a real person, a living person. He's our living Lord. And so much focus on the identical nature of some of the miracles, both in Matthew at times, and Luke sharing the same picture of what's happening. And yet there might also be some differences or how they shape the story, because again, they have a trajectory by which they want to communicate to their particular group that they're writing to. Or we simply go back to that possibility of Q. Could Q be the answer to how Matthew and Luke frame their gospel? Possibly, but we don't want to just land there and put all the eggs in that one single basket and say, "Thus saith the Lord," because that would not be congruent with how the writers are writing and framing their gospel account. Now, so I want to sort of land as we close out this mini lecture, is to know this. Number one, each gospel writer has a frame of reference by which they are approaching the life of Jesus. So number one, each writer has a theological purpose. They have a direction that they are intending to go with their writing. And it's your job as the reader to see those ideals, see those trajectories being built out. So Matthew focused on King Jesus. Mark is focused on the servant nature of the Lord. And Luke is looking at Jesus as Lord, and he's not only the servant, but he's a man, but he has divine power and authority. And so when Luke is focusing on some of the miracle natures of Christ's healing work, that's a special attention that Luke wants the reader to know, that Jesus touched the lives of others. Well, number two, each writer has an audience. Again, they set out to write to their people group that they wanted to know. Okay, Matthew, Jewish, Mark, more Roman, and then Luke is very focused on the Greek citizen of the time. And each writer had a time period. You know, they all didn't write at the same time, but within maybe a decade, within 5-6 years of each other. And each writer does present a unified front that Jesus is the Lord. He's the King. He's the ruler. He's the master. And he is our Messiah. And so we want to make sure that we honor that. And then each writer also has a particular take on Jesus' character. They see it differently. And that makes the uniqueness of each of the gospel writers. And it actually helps you explore application differently. And this is why when you go to teach any of the Gospels, there's different application. There's principles to be learned, and God's word is infectious. You know, that's why we can grow and we can mature in our Christian walk. So what do we do here? The Synoptic is a great study. Don't get overly, amused. I don't get overly amused by some of the writers out there that will try to prove Q as the right? The source of all that there is. And I think we don't want to put too much reliance on that. Could we just say that God used multiple writers in such a way? He used their personality, He inspired them, He safeguarded the ability for them to write down all that Jesus said, all that Jesus did. And so God telling Luke, I want you to write with this focus in mind. Matthew, I want you to communicate to your audience who this King Jesus is and why he's the rightful Messiah. And simply that is a biblical theological position you can take and firmly believe this is a good evangelical biblical belief. This is how we arrived at our Synoptic Gospels, and this is how we answer the critics of our day. And I hope that just encourages you and settles your faith. And so you don't doubt, you're not questioning the biblical text, but you're finding meaning and application in each of the writers. And it really is something beautiful to behold, because you realize that, yeah, each of these individuals had different takes, and that's all right. Just like us seeing some type of accident on the road, and there are multiple witnesses, and so they recount what they saw. We all don't see it the same way, and sometimes there are similarities in our account, and so the officer or investigator has to pull all those pieces together. Similarly, you're doing the same thing with each of the gospel writers. They see things differently, and yet they see it at the same way, in the same view. They see Jesus. Jesus is Lord, and let that be what shapes your life and how you see the biblical text.